Today on Elevate Ordinary, we're talking about the Four Temperaments and how they play into our life in Christ and growth in virtue. We'll see you in a moment. Well, welcome back to Elevate Ordinary. I'm your host, JonMark Grodi.
And I'm Teresa Grodi.
And we're back with another extraordinary conversation about the ordinary pursuit of truth, goodness, and beauty. And it's going to be extraordinary today because our guest is writer and speaker, Conni Rossinni. We're really excited to talk to her about the temperaments today. But before we get to that, I want to remind you, as always, that if you go to awakencatholic.org/donate, you can become part of the AWAKEN Nation, supporting this mission of sharing truth through beautiful media. We really appreciate the support. And actually, you can support this show directly during that process. You'll see a little drop down. Do that. That's helpful. Also, you can download the app by going to theawakenapp.io. Download the app. It's the best way to follow the content, interact with the hosts and other members of the AWAKEN Nation. Also, there's some special stuff for you if you're able to support the work. So check that out. And finally, download the Hallow app. You can go to hallow.app/awaken. It's a great app, Catholic meditation app. Many of us here use it. We've been listening to Father Mike Schmitz's podcast, and our kids go to sleep listening to Jonathan Rumi reading the Gospel of Matthew. It's really cool. And if you go to hallow.app/awaken, you'll get a free month subscription of that, and it also supports our ministry, and we really appreciate that. Thank you very much. So, Teresa, why don't you introduce our guest today?
Hi, Connie. We have Conni Rossinni with us today. You can see her here on the screen. There she is, joining us from Omaha, Nebraska. You guys have a really fantastic diocese out there, don't you?
Yes, we do. Yeah. It's a nice place to live.
Oh, that's wonderful. So I came across Connie. Actually, Connie, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. As you said, I live in Omaha, Nebraska. We've been here about 4 years. I've got my husband, Dan, who is the editor of the diocesan newspaper. And we have 4 boys whom I homeschool. Actually, the oldest started college last fall.
Nice.
So
Congratulations. Wonderful.
14 years of homeschool, and he made it. Yay. So, and I have written 5 books and co-authored a 6th on different aspects of the spiritual life, including some books on temperaments for children. Yeah. And I also, my husband and I are now giving courses, video courses on different aspects of the spiritual life.
So cool.
Wonderful. You have a background in the Carmelite order.
Yes. Yeah. I was a secular order of Discalced Carmelites. I was a member for about 17 years. Wow. And my husband's job, we've moved across state 3 times since our marriage. So it became impossible for me to keep up the commitment, which included going to meetings every month. Yeah. Especially when we had small children, I couldn't take a baby for an hour drive to get to a meeting. So I had to let that go. But I'm very much a Carmelite spirituality person. My brother is one of the co-founders of the Carmelite monks of Wyoming. So Carmelite is where we're at.
Yeah. Oh, that's wonderful. I've been discerning with a Benedictine monastery. But again, I can't there's no way I can make the commitments. I couldn't even imagine making the commitments for 10 years. So just praying about it, keeping it in my mind. So that's, I like seeing how the different spiritualities in the church sometimes call, to our temperament, to who we are, and how we're made and how God wants us to serve him. So I first came across you, Connie, when my first child was around toddler age, 2, 3. And he was just a sweet child, so smart, so diligent, very outgoing, extroverted. But when he was 2 or 3, he started having these horrific temper tantrums. I mean, he would go from sweet, 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 happy, smart kid to I'd have to carry him out of a place, kicking and screaming, spitting, pulling my hair. We once walked out of a Dr. Ray Guarendi talk. He was kicking me, punching me in the stomach. I'm like, it's this talk on parenting. But I like his temper tantrums were just so horrible that I was just like, there's something mentally wrong with this child. And we were living in Steubenville at the time. And of course, that's like a multi-generational Catholic homeschooling, big families like area. And these older moms would be like, oh, no, he's fine. That's normal. And I'm like, why don't I ever see anyone else's child act like this? And I was really distraught about it. And I had picked up this book called The Temperament God Gave Your Kids, I think. I don't know who it's by. But as I was reading through the temperaments, when I read sanguine, and the four temperaments are choleric, sanguine, melancholic, phlegmatic. Maybe you can tell us a little more about them in just a second. And when I read the chapter on the sanguine, it was like they followed him around. Like it was exactly what I had been seeing in my child, down to the temper tantrums, down to like name calling, kicking, spitting during temper tantrums. And I was just like up until that point, I had thought like, I get this blank slate of a child and I just do all the right things and he becomes this perfect saint. And it wasn't until I had read that book that I was like, wait a second, like perhaps he gets this personality from God, from nature, how he's wired. And it's my job to learn that particular personality and shepherd him and be his spiritual director, his first spiritual director. And so that was just how, and then I started Googling Catholic temperaments, and your blog, The Contemplative Homeschool, came up, and I think I read all your blog articles, and you said I reached out to you on Pinterest, which I don't even remember. But we bought the book on the cholerics. A spiritual growth plan for your choleric child. And we've got it dog-eared everywhere. We love it. So it's very exciting to have you on today.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. And you had actually, you were telling us before, you had a similar experience when you had your first child too. Would you tell us a little more about that?
Sure. Yes. My husband and I are both introverts. He is primarily melancholic. I'm primarily phlegmatic. And our first child was almost pure choleric. So on the cover of my choleric book, I have a lion cub, and that's kind of what a choleric child is like. So similar to you, I just thought that there was something wrong with my kid. I thought that he was so out of control that either he was going to end up in an institution or I was. I mean, from the day I brought him home from the hospital, he never took a nap. He didn't sleep at night. When his brother was born 20 months later, he would run by while I was nursing and hit his brother on the head. His favorite activity was throwing toys down the stairs, and watching them boom, bang, bang all the way down. And I was going nuts. So I came across a book on raising your spirited child, which was very helpful in some respects, but it led me to keep looking until I also came across that same series. It was by Art and Lorraine Bennett about the temperament God gave you. And then I began to see, okay, he's the opposite temperament from me. This isn't something that's a flaw in him. It's just a very, very different way of looking at the world, a very, very different way of operating. And if I can understand him, maybe we can work something out where we're not going to drive each other nuts.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about the temperaments. For those who aren't familiar with them, we can kind of give a little overview, but maybe also comment, if you would. I think sometimes when people are unfamiliar with this kind of a conversation, there's kind of two reactions they might have to it. Either people hear about temperament or personality stuff and they think, oh, that's all just a bunch of nonsense. Everyone's completely unique and there's no patterns to really be seen. Or they maybe go in the other direction of assuming that like you can figure out somebody's personality down to a T. Where the temperaments kind of fit into that, and maybe a little bit where do we receive this concept from?
Yeah, well, temperament is different from personality. Temperament is really considered to be something that's inborn. So you're born with it. Scientists have not yet pinpointed what genes are involved in your temperament. But way back in ancient Greece, Hippocrates, the father of medicine, recognized that there's really 4 basic ways that people operate naturally, and then different variations on them. And so we still look at, he gave them the names choleric, melancholic, phlegmatic, and sanguine, because he believed that they were related to having an excess of some kind of bodily fluid. So if you had too much blood, you were sanguine. If you had too much phlegm, you were phlegmatic, etc. So that's why we have these really strange names.
Sure.
So people, in modern times don't believe it has anything to do with bodily fluids, but generally speaking, we do believe that it's a biological thing. It's something physical. There's something in the way that God made our bodies that determines our temperaments. So temperament, really at the root of it, it is talking about how you naturally react to stimuli. Do you react really slowly or really quickly to stimuli? Do you react mildly or strongly? And then how long do those impressions last? Do you very quickly move on to the next thing, or do you kind of stay there with your impressions? So that's temperament. It's the basis of our personality, but personality also includes things like our environment, the family we grow up in, our education, and then very much the decisions that we make in life and our talents as well. So one phlegmatic person will have a lot of similarities with the next phlegmatic person, and yet they're in no way identical twins.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
This is interesting because in our marriage, I remember at one point we had just had like a disagreement, and I reacted, whatever it was, like I reacted, and then we kind of fought, and then intellectually it resolved in my head why we were fighting, and I felt okay, and I was like, okay, and I just went on to the next thing, and he's still sitting here like I'm not resolved. And I'm like, can't you see why?
Yeah.
I mean, we disagreed, and now we understand why we disagreed, and like we can just move on, right?
Yeah.
And we realized at that moment, like, I'm a reactor, but I'm also someone that just kind of like, all right, awesome, water under the bridge, we're done, and I quickly move away, whereas he has to like sit and resolve it.
Yeah.
And
I had this conversation with a colleague, I think last year at one point, because I realized that he would come to me with ideas, and in the moment I'd panic a little bit because I would feel like I need to give him an answer right then and there. And over time I realized, wait a minute, no, I just need to tell a person, that's an interesting idea. I'm going to sit with that for a couple of days and I'll get back to you, because I have an initial impression, but it takes me a while to be able to verbalize it or to understand my own feelings about it. And so that's probably a melancholic sort of thing.
Yes, that sounds like melancholic. So that's very important.
Yeah.
Actually, a lot of melancholics will sit and they'll be ruminating, thinking over the question, and they say nothing because they're so interiorly focused. They assume that everybody else knows what's going on inside their head as well as they do in a certain way.
Yeah.
So if you just say, okay, I'm going to think about that, but I'll get back to you, that's very helpful for the people around you to know that you're not ignoring them. It's not that you think that what they're asking about is unimportant, but you just need some real time to think before you can come back with your answer.
Right. Well, in the anecdotes we've given, and just that example right there, I mean, obviously it becomes, hopefully, those listening in, even if they're really new to the temperament idea, I think we can see that how this could be so important for our understanding of ourselves, particularly with a practical eye toward the life of virtue. That if we're put on this earth for a purpose to grow in holiness and to pursue God and to imitate Him, a lot of that comes down to our habits, our virtues, our vices. But so much of that is tied up with understanding, why do I react to the things I react to? Or oftentimes we act in ways we don't understand. Once we understand them a bit better, then we can make more prudent plans for how to build those habits. Yeah,
we always say like prudence is the right response to reality. And so you have to understand the reality of the situation, the reality of your own thought process and your own, natural inclinations. And as Mr. Darcy says, we'll get to that in a couple episodes, but everybody has their own natural vices or inclination, whatever, it doesn't matter. Yeah.
So in terms of understanding those better, like how does one sort of figure that out about themselves? About how do you sort of identify yourself?
So traditionally, there are 2 questions you can ask yourself to get a good idea of what your primary temperament is. And the first one is, do I react to stimuli, whether it's exterior or interior? Do I react to it quickly, or does it take me a long time to react? So if you react quickly, you are generally an extrovert. If it takes you a long time, you have to think about it first, and then you react. That's the introverted temperaments.
Now,
go ahead.
Can you dig into, when we talk about react here, because I realized last year that I think I had a misunderstanding about these for a long time, because when I would think of reaction, I noticed in myself that I'd have a quick reaction in terms of my impression. Like I'd have a lot of feelings real quick, but I couldn't express those or do anything with those. And so I think over time I realized, wait a minute, okay, I don't react quickly. I have feelings, but the reaction in terms of like processing it, that's what takes me a longer time. So maybe dig into what does it mean reacting quickly or slowly?
Yeah, I think you've got it there. That the extroverted temperaments, they really figure out what they're thinking by how they act and what they say. Whereas the introverted temperaments, we need to really process those thoughts for a long time and examine the question from many different sides before we say, oh, this is what I really think. This is what I really feel. And then we can express it only once we've come to that realization interiorly.
Right.
So that's why the reaction, at least on the outside, is much slower. You're right that sometimes, especially if you've got habits, you talked about habits of virtue and vice. I know I'm a phlegmatic, but I can react very strongly towards certain stimuli. Like if my kids behave in a certain way, I can yell right away. Why? Because of my habits. Because I've been in that situation time and time again, and I'm used to reacting in that situation. So that can muddy the waters a little bit. But then to distinguish the 2 extroverted temperaments from each other, or the 2 introverted temperaments from each other, the second question that you ask is, how long do impressions last? How long do I stick with them? So some people very quickly move on. They might react very fast to an impression, but then the next impression comes along and they move on to that and they forget what is behind. And that's kind of what I heard Teresa saying about herself. That's more of the sanguine temperament. Whereas other people, they might react quickly or slowly at first, but some of them will very, very, for a long time, stick with that idea. So the melancholic especially is going to be the person who reacts most slowly and who hangs on to his impressions for the longest time. So he lives more or less in the future and the past than he does in the present. He's always thinking of what's going to come, or he's thinking of what already happened. Whereas the sanguine, the opposite, is living almost completely in the present. What's happening right now? What happened 5 minutes ago doesn't matter anymore. Like you said, it's water under the bridge. What's going to happen 5 minutes from now? Who cares? You know, I'm in the present. Let's deal with this right now. So those are kind of the questions you can ask. So sanguine reacts very quickly, but very quickly moves on. Choleric reacts very quickly, but tends to hang on to his impressions. Melancholic reacts very slowly and stays with those impressions for a long time. Phlegmatic might not seem to react very much at all, but the phlegmatic, the impressions that come, she's going to react slowly to them, but move on much more quickly than the melancholic would.
Okay, so here once again, I feel like I've heard these maybe perhaps too many times before, and so maybe some of the meaning is lost in there. When we talk about holding on to impression, could give us some examples, a little bit of that, like, because again, when I think about myself, okay, the reaction part that makes sense to me now. But what is it when we're talking about holding on to an impression? Is that like if I meet somebody and I make a first impression, whether I kind of hold on to that picture of them or whether my mind is easily changed? What is it? What's kind of being got out there by that phrase?
Yeah, a lot of it is, what are you thinking about afterwards? So, so if I have a conversation with somebody online, and let's say I have a disagreement with them online, some people can have an argument with somebody online, and 5 minutes later, that person is their best friend. It doesn't matter what they've gone through. They just move right on.
Gotcha.
For people whose impressions stay with them longer, they will be thinking about that conversation all day long, and maybe the next day and the day after that, depending on what their temperament is. So is it consuming your thought life? Are you directing your activities toward that impression that you received?
That's interesting. It's almost like we've got acceleration and inertia. Like, how quickly do you accelerate, and how much do you have a tendency to continue on with the particular feeling?
Yeah, and I would say inertia is how I would describe the phlegmatic temperament in one word. Yeah. They are the person that, if they are in motion, they tend to stay in motion. And if they are at rest, they tend to stay at rest. And either way, you can't really get them to move or to stop from outside forces. It has to come from within.
Oh, that's interesting.
So really quickly before we go on, just to make sure that no one missed them. Okay, so we've got the melancholic. That's the slow, slow to get moving, slow to react, and then slow, and then they hold on for a long time. The opposite of that is the sanguine, which is a quick reaction and a quick to move on. And then the choleric is the quick to react, but holds on.
Right.
Determined sort of. And then the phlegmatic is what's left here?
Slow to react.
Slow to react. And then quick to move on. Got it. Cool. Okay.
So this is funny because in my head, I'm thinking of the differences in the choleric and the sanguine. And perhaps if you're like a choleric sanguine, which I think I'm pretty close to 50-50, but I mean, whatever that means. But so sometimes, like when you brought up the internet stuff, like I can't get on the internet and have discussions with people because it disrupts me too much. So my choleric comes out in that moment. But like with my children or with family members, it's so much easier to just like let it go afterwards. And I'm wondering, like, is it a habit? Is it a virtue that I've acquired? That if I have a relationship with someone, like, is it something that I've worked towards where like maybe my initial reaction is to stew, but over time, like coming to know God and trusting in him more and trusting in his mercy more, like have I acquired this habit of like letting things go, particularly with people I have relationships with? Like it's harder for me to stew when I have a relationship with someone than it is for like some stranger out there that I can do nothing about. Then I stew forever. And so I don't know, like I mean, I guess you don't know me, but like I'm just trying to think like.
Yeah, that could be. It could be, the maturity that you have come to personally, psychologically, spiritually. It could just be different sides of you are going to, come to the fore in different situations. I think the internet brings out the worst in just about everybody. So, I mean, since I'm primarily phlegmatic, the thing that they hate the most is conflict. So, face to face, I don't argue with anybody except my own family. Okay. So actually within the family, I will argue with people a lot.
Oh, that's interesting.
People outside of the family, I want to keep the peace. So, but if they're on the internet and I don't have to look at them face to face, well, then it all comes out, all my disagreements, I'm not afraid to put out.
So that is really interesting because I love having hard and difficult. Like I don't seek them out. Like I'm not like, oh, I better go have this discussion with this neighbor that I had a hard time. I don't like that. But once the conversation gets rolling, it's just like, I love fighting with not like fighting mean, but just like having a real disagreement and like not letting go and getting that other person to see what, but like when it's on the internet or when it's in like a newspaper, like I can't read apologetics books. I can't read Catholic atheist discussion books because they drive me insane and I think about them forever. But perhaps that's because I can't do anything about that. But with the person in front of me, there is some, like you have to look eye to eye. You have to recognize that person's dignity. Like I'm certainly not going to lop their head off or throw stones at them in front of me. But you're right. Like when they're not there, it's kind of, you can't, in another way, like you can't touch them. Yeah. You can, like you can't make any real difference. You can just fight, and it's horrible. And it just stays with me forever. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, as we noted,
this is Teresa's like personal like therapy.
We're gonna figure you out.
I'm just kidding.
We talk a lot about the virtues. We're real big on the cardinal virtues. We talk, so prudence, justice, fortitude, temperance. We've talked a lot about them on here. We like to have that framework in mind so we can tie this back. Because I like how the virtues give us this great picture of how the human person works. We are intellect, which our intellect guides our will, and then we have our will directs our passions as best as it can toward the right places. They don't always go to the right places. A lot of times we find ourselves as very passionate people. We have a lot of feelings. We have a lot of inner things going on. And we, in the midst of all those feelings, we have to still make good choices. Well, again, with the temperaments, we can understand some of those movements of the heart better. So that we can make more practical, more wise, prudent plans about how to handle ourselves, how to make a rule of life, how to go about our spiritual life, how to build the needed virtues, and to get rid of the vices that we have. And so, I mean, let's move to that a little bit. Like you have a lot of background in writing and thinking about this. If one kind of goes through those questions and begins to get a sense of their temperament, where do they start maybe? What are some of the ways that they can begin to use that knowledge in terms of their prayer life or their practical virtue and vice life? What are some ways that they can begin to use that practically?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to realize that temperaments are a good thing.
Yeah.
So there are some people who will think that you have to overcome your temperament, or they erroneously teach that you need to become a balance among all four temperaments. That just can't happen.
Yeah.
So temperament is something that God gave you. It's his gift to you. But because of the fall, everything that is a good gift we can use wrongly. Right. So it really helps once you pinpoint, let's say that you've pinpointed that you are a choleric, and that for you, justice is really, really important. Well, that can be very helpful in your spiritual life. It can help you to make sure that you are acting justly towards other people. It can, a choleric might be somebody who wants to start a new organization that's helping people find justice, really, either in law or maybe helping people who have been abused or hurt or something of that sort of thing, in order to bring justice. But on the flip side of that, because you are so strong on justice, you could be very judgmental towards other people. You could see the world as fundamentally unfair and be angry about that, lash out at people when you see them behaving unjustly. So knowing that is your temperament, you can start to say, okay, why did God give me this idea of justice? Why? How does he want me to use that? And how have I been acting in the past and misusing that in a way that is actually hurting other people and hurting my relationship with God instead of furthering God's kingdom on earth?
Yeah. Yeah. It's, again, going back to the virtues here, we have talked often about, my favorite author on this subject is Joseph Pieper, drawing from St. Thomas Aquinas. And he makes such a big point at the beginning of his book on the cardinal virtues, a point that's not often familiar even amongst people who talk a lot about the virtues, which is Thomas's emphasis on prudence as this steersman of the virtues. It's the cardinal of the cardinal virtues. It's the mother and mold of all moral virtue. It's the virtue bearer. And that great example there, you can have a person who's temperamentally very intent on justice. And that's probably a lot of the choleric temperament, is someone who's very intent on justice, getting things done, action-oriented kind of a thing. But those examples you gave, that person, that they have to make sure that that's being connected back to reality and to this prudent attentiveness to, God, what do you want me to do with this? Because if I'm just going with my thirst for justice, well, sometimes that gets me into fights. Sometimes that gets me into, angry battles. But it's saying, Lord, no, what do you gave me this gift? Where do you want this to be done? There's a lot of the discernment there.
So I'm actually, oddly enough, thinking about when we host parties.
Yes.
In our mom's group, at times we'll have like big mom nights or things like that, and people will come to our home. I love hosting. I love having people over. I can have people over at like the drop of the hat. I don't clean. We do it. We just have a party. That's what sanguines do, right? But I realized early on that once people show up, so I have a background in event planning, so I can plan an event, but once people show up, I am like totally focused on having conversation. And I just I become the conversation person, and I pay all the attention to the people and like talk. And I realize like no one has water, no one has glasses, no one knows where the food is, no one knows where the bathroom is. Yeah. And like, I'm just focused on having conversations with the people. So in learning that about myself, I realized that I need to delegate to another person who's there before the event that, can you just make sure, like, can you be the second hostess and just make sure that I'm not, people aren't without seconds or without drinks or without silverware or whatever it is that I've forgotten. Mm-hmm. Because I have a propensity for throwing parties, but I realize now that I'm deficient in some of the areas that make for a really good and hospitable party.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that self-knowledge is so important, that you've recognized that in yourself, and then you made the adjustments and you're doing something to remedy that, which is really a strength in you. But if people are not getting their water or their, snacks or whatever, it can lead to an area of weakness, right? Or it can bring about a bad result if somebody's not covering that. In my family, we're all very, very aware of what our temperaments are and what everybody else's temperament is. And so whenever there's some kind of conflict, I'm the phlegmatic, so I'm the peacemaker. Oh. So I bring people together and we're like, okay, now try to understand it from his perspective. Your brother's a sanguine. He's not going to see it the same way as you do as a melancholic. So it helps us to really start looking beyond our own little tunnel vision and seeing, okay, this other person has strengths as well. His opinion might have something that he can offer me, his talents. Let's all somehow figure out how we're going to work together to understand each other and to come to an agreement and then move forward on whatever project it is that we're involved in.
You have some really neat lesson plans in the back of this choleric book. Now, you have a guide on cholerics and a guide on phlegmatics because you're doing it based on what kids you've grown, right? So your oldest is choleric?
My oldest is choleric. My second is actually melancholic. Oh. But I am secondarily very strongly melancholic. My husband is melancholic. My sister that I'm very close to is melancholic. I understand melancholics very well. So my melancholic child is actually the easiest for me to parent. Mm-hmm. So there hasn't been the motivation. I've gotten about halfway done with a melancholic book, and it's been sitting there for a long time. Yeah. So I'm determined to finish it this year because a lot of people ask about it. My phlegmatic is my third child. He's phlegmatic sanguine, whereas I am phlegmatic melancholic. So there are a lot of differences between him and me because of that secondary temperament. Mm-hmm. And then my fourth is sanguine. So we have one of each temperament in our 4 kids. So I'll be doing the Sanguine temperament last.
Oh, I'm looking forward to it.
So once people have gone through the exercise, maybe with themselves and their family a little bit, I mean, there's the making the identification, but I feel like then there's a process over time of observing your own feelings and behaviors and other person's, and beginning to understand them through the lens of the temperament better. I was thinking about we talk a lot about the evening examen, which is a very normal recommendation for Christians to do, is to make an examination of your day, examination of conscience kind of a thing. I think sometimes people don't do that because they're thinking of it just as, I'm writing down my list of my sins and feeling bad about myself. But I think with the temperaments in mind, it's what happened today, and then let's look at what led up to that, right? Because that's a lot of what this is it's all the internal stuff that comes before maybe the word or the action.
Right. And if I can understand what my motivations are, then it's going to be much easier to change my behavior. Right. Because, every behavior, we choose what we think is good in the moment, right? Yeah. So why do I think that this particular choice, which ended up being a bad choice, why did I think that would be a good thing? Well, maybe I was trying to protect myself somehow. Maybe I was being forced to make a decision too quickly before I was ready. How can I then, knowing my temperament, change that so that next time I'm in the same situation, I react in a more virtuous way?
Yeah. Every time we go to confession, we pray that we promise the Lord, we tell the Lord that we're going to try to avoid sin, but also avoid the near occasions of sin. And I feel like the near occasions of sin, there's a lot of variety amongst people, but a lot of that's going to come down to temperament in the sense of the kinds of situations that get me into trouble. But I have to be, again, going through that little bit of investigation after the fact to see, okay, what are those patterns, those situations for me?
Yeah,
absolutely. Go ahead.
Sorry. Being a sanguine or partial sanguine or whatever, keeping a spiritual journal, like I have a spiritual director, so I want to have in my head, I was like, well, I need to have something to bring to him. So I'm going to start keeping a spiritual journal. But once I started, sanguines have a hard time remembering. So once you're past that impression, the new thing that shows up is your new normal and you just start living it. And so keeping the spiritual journal, I started noticing at one point that I would write the same phrases, totally the exact same phrases. And I would have really obsessive thoughts. And for some reason, it occurred to me, we use natural family planning. And so I chart my cycle, and it occurred to me to check at what point in my cycle I was every time I had these obsessive phrases that I would put in like paranoid, just paranoid-ish phrases. And it turned out it was the same time in my cycle every single time. And so then I started paying attention going forward. And sure enough, it would show up the same 4 or 5 days. It would just be the same thought patterns, the obsessiveness. And then once I realized that, I was able to be this will pass. Before it was didn't I get over this? I'm back to this. I thought I accomplished it, but then it was just okay, I just have to write out these 4 or 5 days with these, these solutions, these temporary solutions, turn on music instead of following this pattern of thinking, turn on some music or read a book or, occupy your mind. And it was so helpful. Because I have a hard time with memory, right? I just go to the next thing and that's the next thing. So I guess I do have a question for you, a really long way to ask you a question. But as a sanguine or somebody who moves past to the next thing quickly, how do I keep my memory? My memory of where I've been, the lesson I've learned, and how do I take that with me into the future?
Well, I think that what you are doing is really important, that there has to be somehow that the sanguine is reflecting and probably writing things down. So the sanguine needs to, even though he or she wants to be with people all the time, has to learn to take some time to reflect, even though that doesn't come naturally to that person.
Sounds like torture.
Yeah.
Not gonna lie.
But, whether you have a spiritual director or not, just doing that journaling, maybe, after you've prayed, just say, okay, 5 things. This is, I'm going to write even 5 words of what happened during my prayer time, or
that's a great
at the
idea.
end of the day, when you do that examine, write down a word or two. Okay, what were the graces today? What were the difficulties today? So that you can look back in over those patterns. I just put on my blog 2 days ago a spiritual planner and prayer journal that I designed.
Nice.
So people can check that out at Contemplative Homeschool, because I know that a lot of people like to journal, and there's not a lot out there that's geared towards Catholic like meditation on scripture.
Yeah.
But not just sanguines. I mean, I, as a phlegmatic, when I go to spiritual direction, I hear all these great ideas that my spiritual director has. I write them all down, and then I forget all about them. I never implement them. And I have the best intentions, and I don't do them because I don't look back at my notes. So that's one thing, an area where the phlegmatic has to become more disciplined to, set a specific time. Maybe when I do my examen at night, I'm going to look back at what I'm supposed to be doing according to what I've written down from spiritual direction, and saying specifically, did I do what my spiritual director recommended that I do? Or did I forget about it again?
Right. So then on the flip side, this is really interesting. So the flip side, then we've got the choleric and the melancholics, where they often probably have the opposite difficulty of being able to let things go, and as you noted too, not living always in the past or the future, being able to be present. That's probably often very hard for the choleric and melancholic, who are determined to get back to the problem or get back to the fight, or to even though you're here, you're still thinking about the argument you had this morning. And so too, like, how do they begin to learn to be more present? I wonder.
I think for the melancholic, it's the opposite for the sanguine, even though he loves to be alone and spend time alone, sometimes the melancholic has to make the sacrifice of being with other people.
Yeah.
I think the melancholic is very dutiful. So if he is given tasks to do, he will concentrate on those and get those done. And hopefully having these outside tasks that he has to work on, maybe a physical task, especially, or just going for a walk, or, going to the gym and having a workout, maybe will get the melancholic out of his head a little bit, so that he's not always just in the interior. Same thing with having a conversation with other people. Even though it makes him uncomfortable sometimes, he's got to reach out more, do more socializing, just so that he's not always focused on those interior things, which, wounds and ways that people have sinned against him, he's never going to forget if he's always thinking about them.
Yeah.
The choleric is very agenda driven. So I know my choleric son really likes to have, he likes to know what's coming up ahead. So even in really trivial things, like if we're going to watch a movie together as a family, we've been watching Lord of the Rings, just started rewatching the trilogy.
Yes.
Yeah.
And he wants to know, at 6 o'clock in the evening, are we going to watch something tonight, and at what time?
Oh my gosh.
That's
Dominic waiting for shipments in the mail.
Sorry. If we come to him at 8 p.m. and say, we want to watch this, well, he's involved and he's, working on a book that he's writing, or doing homework or whatever. No, that's not his agenda now. So that's one of the ways that we can help the cholerics out, is by giving them a heads up. Hey, this is what's expected coming up. So be mentally prepared to, at 8 o'clock, shut down your computer, close your book or whatever, and join in this activity with the rest of us.
I love, you mentioned earlier something I hadn't thought about before in terms of the temperaments, and that's that they're a bodily thing, they're a biological thing. And that makes me think something we've talked a lot about here, and Andrew Reinhardt over on his show, Physically Spiritual, talks a lot about, looking at ourselves as a whole integrated human being, and recognizing how all aspects of our humanity play together. But, more poignantly thinking of how our reactions, they happen. They're a bodily event. You know, like when you get anxious, you know, you feel it right there. That's where I feel it. I feel it in the pit of my stomach.
Right here.
And I feel like keeping that in mind, like the example I was thinking of with the choleric is, you know, so our son Dominic is choleric, and I can definitely see how it's so jarring for him to not know what's coming or to have the plans unexpectedly change. And sometimes we think of that as it's a purely an intellectual thing. Why can't they just get this? But we have, you know, I think it helps us to be merciful to people around us, to recognize that this is actually a very bodily, visceral experience this kind of a person has, you know, in response to the plans changing. He feels it. He feels it here, you know, and that maybe helps me to be more merciful in saying, to help him act best, to help him be most in control of himself, I need to take that into account so that I don't throw him into a situation that is just very difficult for his particular temperament. Yeah.
Yeah, I think all of us, whatever temperament we are, we have certain situations that would tend to make us anxious or depressed.
Yeah.
And especially if you have a psychological inclination that way, you know, we really need to watch what it is that is going to trigger that. So for the choleric, it's, you know, he can, if he doesn't have an agenda, he can get really depressed, or he can get really anxious if his agenda is suddenly taken away from him. And so he does get that, you know, jittery feeling just because he thought he was going to concentrate on this and suddenly he can't because of somebody outside.
That's me for sure.
Wow.
Yeah.
I was thinking, so another variation, I feel like, of all this, and I'm thinking of my own temperament here. So melancholic, you'd think with the slow reaction time and the slow to hold on, you have a person who, I can't remember how you described it, but, you know, like I tend to swing between either being, you know, very detail oriented, you know, lists and plans and charts that I stick to and I work through and I love that kind of stuff, to, if I'm not like caring for myself, you know, mentally and spiritually and physically, so that I'm actually preparing for that, then I'm overwhelmed by all that stuff that I'm not prepared for. And so I tend to swing between like super driven, detail-oriented, working through stuff, projects, plans, to almost despairing and just like throwing it all off, because the way that my mind works, my reaction works, I want to do it big or go home. Like I need to be fully organized and planned and understand it. Otherwise, I'm just like, I can't even adult today, you know, like that. So.
Is there a temperament? So maybe this is a temperament thing. So I realized maybe about 10 years ago that I had to not watch certain movies because they would keep me in a space for like days. So two types of movies. One would be like romance movies. Like if I watched movies where like the heroine was always being like her heart ripped out and someone was hurting her, I would like put that on the relationship that I was in, you know, like he's going to cheat on me and and then the other was like post-apocalyptic movies where the world, like there's no God, obviously, because in those movies, there's just like no God. And then like everything is going, like everything is crashing down. And those are my funnest movies. I love watching them. I love action and big, you know, but then for days afterwards, I would just be depressed and hopeless and despairing. And I had to stop watching those kind of movies.
Yeah. Well,
I think because of the sanguine is really influenced by things outside ourselves, so, and by other people. So the people that you hang out with, the environment that you're in, and I think that can probably happen with the movies too. If you're watching a really depressing movie, it might be to you like you've been there and you're experiencing that.
Yeah.
And then your choleric side is hanging on to it. It's not letting you move on. So I think that's probably, it's a little bit of the interplay of the two.
Yeah.
I think that some people can watch a movie and just like, you know, well, depending on the movie, I think all of us can do that. But
you watch just like zombie movies, and I'm like, how can you? Well, you used to watch that one show that everybody watched about zombies, but I'm just like, how can you watch that and then go to bed?
Or certain music. I think I tend to have music that I listen to that Teresa can't listen to because it's too emotionally involved. And it'll stick with her.
Yeah.
Whereas for whatever reason,
it makes him happy. I just don't. Yeah.
Well, but so another interesting thing with music, there's obviously we can't go into all the things, but there's so many areas in life. I feel it's interesting once you have this lens to look at. I've reflected about how it takes me a long time to get into new music. So I have like 4 or 5 albums that have been shared with me in the past 5 or 6 years that I basically just listen to over and over and over. It took me a long time to break into them, almost like a song at a time. I'd have to listen over and over to kind of figure out what it was about, whatever. And then now that I've figured out the album, so to speak, now I listen to it over and over and over again. So it took me a long time to dig in, but now this is like my albums. These are my songs that I listen to. And so it's just interesting how, the temperaments, every aspect of your life, they show these variations on how we respond to things. It's very interesting.
It's probably important to take the discernment of spirits, like St. Ignatius of Loyola's discernment of spirits, into the temperaments, because a lot of these things, the way that we've discerned them is the feeling that comes after, like I did this particular thing and then afterwards I just feel terrible for days, or I did this particular thing and I really, really regret it. Like just really paying attention, or I did this particular thing and I was like filled up for days and days afterwards. It made me smile just thinking about it afterwards, kind of just taking situations and asking like, how did that make me, like what fruit did it bear, I guess, afterwards for my personality and for my spiritual life and for my peace.
I was going to ask about, what, and I know we probably need to bring this to a close soon, but I wanted to be sure to ask, I'm sure you've thought a bit about the temperaments and an individual's development of their prayer life. How does the temperaments give us maybe some insight into how we should go about that in the most effective way for ourselves?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think melancholics are probably the people who are most easily able to pray, like the meditation on scripture, that you're really drawn to that. You have really high ideals and you can reflect in the moment a lot better than some of the other temperaments can. But I think it's important for a melancholic person to make sure that some of their meditations are on lighter subjects, that they're not always meditating on portions of scripture that are about, the end of the world is coming, or, Job or something like that, right? Because it's not healthy. So you could maybe use the Psalms or another part of scripture, or Jesus with the children, or something that's a little bit more uplifting, especially if you are going through some difficult time, or you've had something happen in your life that has hurt you and you're tending to focus on that hurt too much. I think my phlegmatic son has found that the examine prayer works really well for him. He's kind of made that into his mental prayer. It's a little bit less structured. So he's, not confined, and his lower energy is able to get through all the parts of it and do the reflections without feeling like, oh, I have to do A, B, C, and I'm just overwhelmed. I think that the sanguine is probably going to have a lot of troubles with exterior distractions in prayer. So it's important for a sanguine to pick a place to pray where there's no work around. Obviously, there's no people nearby, if possible. That maybe, like I've got my dresser, you can see behind me, has a little shrine where I pray in my bedroom. So use these exterior things to draw you into God's presence. I think that can be really helpful for the sanguine in particular, and to look at the crucifix or look at an icon or a holy picture to draw you back into God's presence. Mm-hmm. And then the choleric, frankly, I'm still trying to figure out the choleric.
I was going to ask about that. That one seems like difficult.
So with my choleric son, I taught him mental prayer a long time ago. He's still trying to make it his own and figure out just exactly what how he should be doing prayer in a way that he has affinity toward. He likes to be in control and have his own agenda. So I think having steps that I have recommended, he kind of reacts against that because he wants to, do it his way. So that one is a little bit harder for me right now.
Yeah, I've noticed that a lot with my son, that I get worried sometimes because in the moment it's hard to get him to focus on something that he's just not super interested in right now. Like if he doesn't have a strong interest in it, I'm beating my head against the wall to try to get him to focus on maybe an aspect of prayer or the faith that I'm very intent on. But he'll come around later, when something finally clicks from him, then he'll say or do something that I'm recognizing, okay, that thing, it took a while to settle in, but now it's meaningful to him, and now it's coming out in prayer or in good action. But in the moment, it's hard to get him to focus on what I want him to focus on.
I almost wonder if so our son's 9, so he's not very old. Okay. But I almost wonder if taking him to a religious gift store and just letting him pick out his own devotional may be something that, because like we have a big library, but it's still all our books, and maybe he doesn't want to read any of those spiritual books, but letting him pick his saint that he really likes. Like he's named Dominic. We named him after the great Dominic, but he insists, like, I love Saint Dominic Savio. And I've kind of stopped fighting it, just stop fighting it's an error, but it's not a bad thing. You know what I mean? Like it's not.
Right.
So letting him take Saint Dominic Savio, because he chose it. Yeah. You know what I mean?
Yes. Yes. I had to learn that in homeschool a lot with my choleric son, is that I had an idea of what I wanted him to learn and how I thought we should go about it. And I had to learn that I can just give him the subject and let him figure out how he wants to learn it. And if he has a completely different idea of how to delve into it than I did, if I wanted him to write a report and he wants to make a, PowerPoint slideshow or something like that, to let him do that and to just let go and realize that the end result is probably going to be just as good and he'll be happy with it. And I won't be fighting him the whole time.
Yeah. Yeah, that's two cholerics homeschooling is, the choleric that's been a difficult thing to learn.
I wanted to read this quote I found from Lewis talking a little bit about the temperaments. This is from Mere Christianity. He writes, "But though natural liking should normally be encouraged, it would be quite wrong to think that the way to become charitable is to sit around trying to manufacture affectionate feelings. Some people are cold by temperament. That may be a misfortune for them, but it is no more a sin than having a bad digestion is a sin. And it does not cut them out from the chance or excuse them from the duty of learning charity." I like this notion, this reminder in the temperaments that, as you said, they're gift. And so we get to know that gift, and that gives us the opportunity, the chance, but also the duty to guide that gift into its right groove. And if we understand that in ourselves, but also in the people around us, like we can help each other better, to use those gifts and to blossom as best as possible. So, well, this has been a wonderful conversation, Connie. I feel like we could talk about this stuff forever.
I have to stop asking.
I have so many
questions.
directions I would love to take it, but we don't want to keep you forever. But thank you so much for sharing with us and for your work. Maybe before we go, maybe just remind the people again of your blog and your work and any invitations you would like to make for them to connect with you.
Yes. So my blog is contemplativehomeschool.com. I am trying to get people to sign up for my blog so I can do less on social media because, as we all know, Facebook is not very Christian friendly right now. Although I do have a group that has 15,000 members on Facebook, which is Authentic Contemplative Prayer. Yeah. So if you want to learn more about the Catholic tradition of prayer, we talk about it every day there if you're on Facebook. As I mentioned at the beginning, I've got those courses that my husband and I are teaching together, video courses that we offer about 4 times a year. So we've done one on detachment and one on how to grow in prayer. And we're planning for the fall a course specifically on mental prayer. So you can find out about all of those at contemplativehomeschool.com.
Wonderful.
Awesome. I'm excited for those.
Yeah, I know, right?
Awesome.
Well, that's great. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Connie.
It's been a pleasure.
You always end the show. I don't know if I'm supposed to say anything. Am I supposed
Yeah,
to?
well,
Okay.
I mean, thank you, Connie, and thank you for joining us. All those who are listening or watching, as always, we want to hear what you're thinking. We want to, hear about your experience with the temperaments, maybe some of your discernment of your temperament, and maybe especially the practical side. How have you found the temperaments as a helpful lens in being more prudent, being more proactive, managing yourself better, and helping those around you better? We'd love to hear that input. Especially, download the app. Go to the AWAKENapp.io. Join our community, and we'd love to hear some of your reflections. Also, if you like what we're doing here, as I said before, we invite you to go to awakencatholic.org/donate and become a member of the nation. Help us to help support this mission of sharing truth through beautiful media. And also download the Hallow app. It's a good, it's a neat tool. Actually, I want to rethink the Hallow app in terms of the temperaments. I feel like there are some temperaments, especially, where that could be an invaluable tool to have, a guided, faithful Catholic meditations, guided audio meditations to help you in your prayer life. I feel like there's some temperaments for whom that would be a spiritual life preserver. So check that out at hallow.app/awaken, where you can get a free month subscription, and also supports our ministry, which we appreciate. So once again, thank you for joining us for this episode of Elevate Ordinary. We'll see you again next time. God bless.
This show and all media on Awaken Catholic is made possible by the Awaken Nation and the Hallow app. The Awaken Nation is a community of people like you who support all things Awaken for as cheap as a cup of coffee a week and get access to exclusive content. Learn more by visiting awakencatholic.org/donate. Hallow is the only audio-guided Catholic prayer app focused on contemplative prayer and traditional Catholic meditation such as Lectio Divina, Daily Examen, and the Rosary. We here at Awaken all use Hallow every day and love it. To learn more or give it a try, visit hallow.app/awaken.